I'm now joined by my guest, Dambisa Moyo, who is a very interesting woman. She was named in 2009 as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. On March 14th, she's actually going to be speaking at a ceremony over in the UK at Westminster Abbey before about 2,000 people, among them Queen Elizabeth and the Prime Minister, David Cameron. So very influential. We're lucky to have her here first. She is also an author. She wrote a book that came out in 2009, Dead Aid, Why Aid is Not Working and How There is a Better Way for Africa. This has to do with U.S. foreign aid. And her more recent book, which just came out February 15th, How the West Was Lost, 50 Years of Economic Folly and the Stark Choices Ahead. Excellent title. Welcome to my show.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Peter.
Well, thank you for being here. Can you give us a little bit of a heads up first? What is the topic of your speech on March 14th?
So, as you know, we've just passed International Women's Day, so I've been asked to speak on women as agents of change. And it's quite an interesting thing, if I may say very quickly. I mean, if you look back in history, in 1869, John Stuart Mill was, really pushing for women's rights, women's participation in the economy and politics. And here we are now with the U.S., really having many more women in the employment sector than there are men. And across Africa, we've got a woman president. Rwanda has more women in parliament than anywhere else in the world. So really interesting times.
Absolutely, absolutely. So tell me a little bit about your book, How the West Was Lost, because I'm making the argument all the time on this show that the U.S. is in decline. In fact, other Western nations are in decline, and the economic mantle has already been passed to the emerging markets because that's where all of the wealth is being created. That's where everything is being produced. That's where you have all the savings and you have the capital investment. You don't have as much taxes. You don't have as much regulation. Is that the general theme of your book?
So what I've done in this book, Peter, is to look at the three key ingredients that drive economic growth. And economists tend to focus really on these three ingredients. Number one is capital, which is money. Number two is labor, which is essentially the workforce. And number three is productivity, which is how efficiently can you utilize your money and your labor. And on these three factors, what I've aimed to do in this new book, How the West Was Lost, is to show how systematically over the last 50 years, U.S. policy in particular, but Western policy in general, has actually eroded these three key ingredients of economic growth and has therefore set the United States and European countries on a path of economic decline. Let me just give you a very quick example of what I mean. So in the capital space, for example, we know that policies, again, in Western countries have been driven by good intentions but bad outcomes. And if you take capital as an example, the U.S. Administration has focused on housing for all, the idea that everyone should have a roof over their head, which sounds like a good idea. But in practice, the idea of keeping interest rates artificially low, offering subsidies and guarantees through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac has led to the subprime crisis. And so I give lots of examples of how policy has failed and therefore set us on this really precarious path.
And not only did it lead to the subprime crisis, which I warned about years in advance, but it's led to a very inefficient and unproductive misallocation of resources in the United States, where too much of our savings and capital gets diverted to building houses, yet we're not building factories. We're not.
And that is a very critical point, because the government really should not be involved in altering the policy environment to make one asset class look artificially more attractive than another. I mean, if you look at the sort of arena of asset classes, we have bonds, we've got stocks, we've got commodities, we've got cash, we've got property. There's no reason why the government should have artificially made housing look much more attractive than all these other asset classes, but that's essentially what they did.
Well, they did it for political reasons, and there were special interests and factions that benefit from those types of subsidies. But the evidence is clear that this is undermining our economy. We got our trade deficit today for the month of January, 15% increase, $46 billion trade deficit. So we're incapable of producing the goods that we need because the resources are going towards things like housing or education or health care. They're going where the government wants them, not where the market needs them.
Well, and ultimately, I mean, as you know, Peter, borrowing per se is not a problem. The problem is if you're borrowing to consume, which is essentially what has happened not only at the government level in the U.S., but also at the individual level. So you have this problem where, for whatever reason, people believed, and the government believed, that it was okay to borrow and consume, and that's why you've ended up with very bloated governments, not just in the U.S., but again across Europe as well, and it's led to large deficits and huge debts.
Well, absolutely. I had the same argument with economist Art Laffer on the Kudlow show one time, where he tried to tell me that it was okay that we're running these deficits because we had a lot of deficits in the 1800s or the 1700s when the country was young. And I pointed out to Mr. Laffer, and he didn't seem to see the difference, that back then we were borrowing to produce. We were borrowing for productive capacity, for infrastructure, to build factories, and that ultimately the capital assets that we acquired with that debt produced enough consumer goods that we could sell them back to our creditors and pay off our debts. And I compared that to today, where we're simply borrowing to consume, and therefore we have no ability to repay the debts.
Well, that's in essence what the issue is. I mean, you cannot continue to survive on a policy of where you're borrowing to consume, whether it's at the micro household level or at the macro level of the government, and that's clearly where the U.S. has got its problems now.
Yeah, so are you have you been making the rounds? I mean, how is your book being received when I've been shot many times. There's a tendency to shoot the messenger when you're delivering bad news.
Well, first of all, with respect to my book, I was thrilled to see it got to number 6 on the New York Times bestsellers list last Sunday, which was fantastic. I think that, more generally, my view is, with both my first book, Dead Aid, and with this new book, How the West Was Lost, my main thesis is I'm appealing to reason. A lot of these things are very common sense. I think a lot of people see this and they understand what the concepts are. And in many ways, I feel like the public policy arena and policymakers specifically are sort of missing a trick and not doing what they should be doing, which is really bringing people on board and helping them understand that this is completely unsustainable. This is, couched in a lot of mistakes and lots of errors, and that fundamentally government needs to only provide an environment to incentivize people to do the right thing. They need to provide some regulation, but not to the point of a stranglehold. And at the same time, they do have to provide some semblance of public goods, but not start becoming a stock picker or encouraging us to pick up one asset over another asset class.
Absolutely. In foreign aid, the real problem there is both parties suffer. The United States suffers and the country that receives the aid. I think Ron Paul said in his speech at CPAC, he described foreign aid as when you take money from poor people in rich countries and give it to rich people in poor countries. And inevitably, the foreign aid actually undermines the recipient because you're simply further empowering people who are impoverishing those nations.
Absolutely, and of course, in a political landscape, aside from all the economic problems of inflation, corruption, debt burden that aid leads to, the fundamental problem is a political one, which is that it severs the link between individuals and their governments. We're simply not able to hold our governments accountable because they're very rationally courting and catering to the donors who are giving them money.
Well, hold on, we got more to discuss. I want to talk about what you see going forward for the U.S. economy. Is there any way out of this? So don't go away. This is Peter Schiff on SchiffRadio.com. Welcome back, everybody. This is Peter Schiff with my guest, Dambisa Moyo. Hopefully I'm pronouncing the name correctly. But, in your book, I think you're talking about the fact that a lot of the problems that we face are the result of politicians who are trying to get reelected, and so they pass politically popular legislation, but it's often very economically damaging. And I think your suggestion is maybe we should lengthen their terms so they don't have to run for reelection as often. How about limiting their terms so they can't run for reelection?
Well, look, I think that certainly there are a lot of issues that, given where the things are right now economically, that emanate from the political situation. I am certainly not advocating that you need to have an authoritarian government, and it may very well be the case that you need to limit their terms. But I think there's certainly something wrong with the current state of affairs. Lengthening a presidential term or a senatorial term is one option, but you could definitely have an argument for limiting their terms to one term. But I think that there's certainly a great acceptance that the political system of hyper-elections, where you have elections every 2 years, it implicitly forces governments to very rationally focus on short-term tactical issues like debts and deficits, which do matter, but, invariably means that they ignore the more strategic and longer-term structural problems like, education, infrastructure, or, and they certainly don't create the environment for for those things to be dealt with.
Well, this is no accident. You know, the framers of the Constitution, when they created this republic, specifically created a republic and not a democracy because they warned us of the dangers. And if we had still had the original structure where senators were appointed by state legislatures, and, you know, even back then, everybody wasn't voting. You had to be 21 to vote, and most people, of course, you know, that means you're in the workforce for many, many years, because people generally, you know, got out of school at 12 or 13, so you'd been working for 10 years. In many cases, you had property qualifications, you had poll taxes, you had literacy tests. There was all sorts of ways that they limited the suffrage just so it wasn't everybody voting, and because they recognized the damage that you could create when you turn elections into advanced auctions on the sale of stolen goods.
Absolutely. And look, you know, you just said exactly what it is. It's a republic. It's not a democracy in the purest sense. I mean, I think that this idea of pandering to polls and basically managing your policies according to where the polls are, I mean, is incredibly damaging, and we see that now. I mean, there are so many big structural problems that the United States absolutely needs to address, but there's really no incentive to address them.
And a lot of people don't. Look, I was a guest on a radio show yesterday out in Chicago, and somebody called up and we were talking about the entitlements, and she was like, well, we don't have to make any cuts because the government will just get the money from somewhere to make the payments. They couldn't understand, well, get it from where? You can't. The government doesn't have any money that it doesn't first take. But there's a lot of people out there that just thinks that money just comes from nothing, and that the government can pay whatever it wants because it has a printing press.
Well, I think that's astonishing that somebody would say that, and I think it's quite reflective of the fact that, again, policymaking and perhaps the discourse in the United States is not really dealing with the situation as it is. If China decides to turn her taps off to the United States, which in many ways she is doing, she's diversifying her own portfolio, moving away from just lending money to the U.S., you could see a situation where interest rates, as we know, the path of interest rates rising could be quite significant and material and really be quite damaging to the United States. And there is no other place to turn to and say, well, we want to get more money. It's just not like that. That's not how it operates. Yeah.
I think, too, in your book, I think you referenced Bernie Madoff in trying to describe the similarities between what we're doing in the U.S. to what Madoff did. I think, you know, when the Madoff crisis first came to light, my idea was that we make him Secretary of the Treasury. Because I thought that's exactly what we need. We need an expert in Ponzi schemes.
That's very funny. Well, I think in the book I basically think that the pension situation is very analogous to a Ponzi scheme, and by that I mean federal pensions. The idea that the young will pay for the old, and you know it may have worked because the demographics worked a few decades ago, but certainly, you know, considering where things are right now, it certainly doesn't work, and it's not going to work in the future. And this is a looming problem.
Did you realize that Bernie Madoff himself, in a recent interview from jail, accused the U.S. government of running a Ponzi scheme?
I didn't know that. No.
He did, in fact, and the media was they were just basically dismissing it as if and saying, well, he has no credibility. And my point is, well, he has credibility in one area, and that's he knows a Ponzi scheme when he sees one because he's run the biggest Ponzi scheme in the history of the world, absent what the U.S. government is doing.
Yeah.
But anyway, I know you're optimistic that America is eventually going to figure this out. I mean, I'm hopeful that we might. But what do you see as any evidence that we're going to get our act together and this is not going to end in a complete crisis, in a destruction of the currency, in runaway inflation? Because that's happened in many examples throughout history when countries have found themselves in similar circumstances than what we have here in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, look, I am sanguine that the U.S. could solve these problems, but I really don't have much evidence that they will. I mean, it was really more aspirational than evidential, based on any form of evidence. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that there's a tension between the current generation in the United States and the future generations of the United States in terms of who it is that the U.S. policymakers are going to cater to.
Anyway, I wish we had more time to discuss it, but we're out of time. I am very much looking forward to reading your book. I intend to do it maybe as early as my trip to Chicago, which is coming up later today. But thank you for being on my show. Good luck, and good luck with your speech next week. Everybody, don't go away. We have another half hour. I will be taking your calls on the Peter Schiff Show on Schiff Radio.